Hi, thanks for joining us. I'm Sarah Brzezinski, the Outreach Coordinator at the Chesapeake Biological Laboratory. Today, I'll be hosting a young alumni interview. It's part of our series where we're trying to find out why graduates decided to study at the Chesapeake Biological Laboratory, how their educational experiences have informed their careers, and how their careers have developed since graduating. Today, I'm lucky to be joined by Brian Gallagher, who is a former student at the lab in the Fishery science discipline. Hi, Brian. How are you doing today?
Hi, Sarah. I'm great. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Can you go ahead and tell us a bit about yourself? Where are you from?
Sure. So I'm Brian. I'm originally from New York, and currently I am a PhD student at Concordia University in Montreal, Quebec, in Canada. So I'm originally from a small town called Warwick, New York. It's in the Hudson Valley, about an hour and a half from New York City. Um, it's a nice little rural area. I spent a lot of time growing up outside, and pretty much every summer growing up, my family and we'd go up to the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York, and I always absolutely loved it up there. I loved going hiking and fishing and catching frogs and salamanders, all that kind of stuff. And I think really from the time I was a kid, I was always really interested in nature and in animals in particular. And then when I was a little older, I got really big into fishing, and ultimately decided to go to a study in college in a marine biology program. The best one in New York State is at Stony Brook University in Long Island. So I went there for 4 years, and I actually ended up going to CBL because, or in part, because I was working with a professor at Stony Brook. His name's Mike Frisk, and he's a CBL alumni. He highly recommended just going to school there. He knew the program, he knew the people. He thought it would be a really good fit for me.
It's
And
great
yeah,
to have that personal
and,
connection.
yeah, and it was also, I was in touch with Dr. Dave Secor, and he had this grant that would fully fund my research at CBL as well. And that's not always the case. That's one of the things you kind of have to figure out when you're applying to grad school, like who has funds to take on a grad student. And Dave just so happened to have this really cool project. So that was sort of a boon as well.
So can you tell me a little bit about that project? What did you end up working on for your thesis research?
I studied the age growth and population dynamics and migration behaviors of white perch in the Hudson River. Essentially, I collected a bunch of white perch, and they have this little bone in their head called an otolith. I extracted that otolith. You take a little section out of the middle, grind it down, look at it under a microscope, and it has these rings on it, like the rings on a tree. And you can use that to determine the age of the fish. So I did that with a bunch of fish that we caught in the Hudson River. You can determine sort of things like age and growth and survival using that information. And then I also used long-term monitoring data to look at sort of their abundance patterns over time, how that's influenced by things like temperature and rainfall, and try to maybe get also some inferences into how the population might change due to climate change in the coming decades.
So when you were at CBL, you were working on your thesis, but then you were also taking classes as part of the graduate program.
Yep.
Was there a particular class or a course project that stands out in your memory or that was particularly exciting for you?
My favorite class that I've ever taken was Population Dynamics by Dr. Mike Wilberg. There's this thing in fisheries management called stock assessment. He gives you insight into how that whole process works. And in addition to sort of showing you, how population dynamics works, how you estimate things like growth rates or mortality rates, or things that are very important if you're trying to sort of, get a short-term projection of where a population is going. In addition to that, he also sort of teaches you how to actually fit statistical models, and he does it using Excel, so you can sort of see everything, visualize it, fill in all the formulas yourself. And for me, I think I've never taken another class that was taught that way. And I think it's quite unique. And even when I'm doing sort of, I do more advanced statistics now using these sort of programming languages, but because of Mike's class, I sort of understand what's going on under the hood.
So can you tell me something that stands out about your experience at the Chesapeake Biological Laboratory?
Yeah, I think one of the really great things about CBL, and one of its, I think, advantages as a smaller lab, is that you really get this very tight-knit sense of community at the lab. I I haven't been to a place since I've left CBL where you have a seminar series and you have chemists, toxicologists, biologists, computer modelers, like all these different interdisciplinary folks in the same room listening. I mean, I think in most other places it tends to be very much structured by department, and like sort of people in different departments don't always necessarily talk to each other. But at CBL, you have a lot of events and a lot of seminars and these sort of and a lot of professional development opportunities that sort of involve everyone at the lab, and that's really cool.
It's a nice close-knit community. I remember when you were there, you used to, I think, organize pickup soccer games and volleyball games.
Yep, yeah, I tried to organize pickup soccer twice a week. I think it started when the World Cup happened and everyone was suddenly excited about soccer, so I convinced a bunch of people to come to the park, kick the ball around, and we kept doing it for a couple of years after that. So
Um, so can you tell me a bit about how your higher education has prepared you to continue on with your education, really, as you're pursuing your doctorate?
sure. So I would say my master's degree, it gave me a really good and deep background on sort of how to do a research project start to finish. Um, I learned a lot about sort of, how to read through the literature to find papers that are really relevant to whatever it is that you're studying. Um, how to sort of how to, for example, if you're like writing an introduction or something, like how to sort of use those papers to like create a narrative about the work that you're doing as well, sort of that technical writing aspect. And also, of course, like just the technical skills of, in my case, it was going out, catching fish, using these different types of sampling gear, um, processing the fish in the lab, analyzing the data on a computer, and sort of summarizing it into graphs and figures and text. And it really does just give you, I think, this sort of you come out of a master's with like much, much greater sort of technical skill and also just critical thinking ability than you do when you start. And that's really set the tone for everything I've done after.
And when you graduated, you took a job with the Virginia Institute for Marine Science, right? Before you went on to pursue your doctorate?
Yep, I worked at VIMS for 2.5 years. I was the chief scientist of their striped bass seine survey, and I learned so much doing that. I got really good at operating boats, trailering boats, doing all of the minute details of sort of planning and executing field work. Tons of fish identification, tons of handling fish. Um, and yeah, just tons of time spent on the water.
That had to be a cool progression, though, because you, at the Chesapeake Biological Laboratory, as part of Dr. Secor's lab, you were part of a seine study, going out in the water and dragging a big 100-foot-long net through the waters every week of the summer. Um,
Yep.
so moving from that to a boat-based seine survey must have been pretty interesting.
Yeah, no, and I think that actually that experience did help me get the job, even though one of the reasons I took it is that I actually didn't have any real boating experience before I took the job. But yeah, I had some experience actually in being involved in a seine survey at CBL. Um, Dave always posts updates about the seine survey on Twitter, and I always follow it. And yeah, and I know they're still doing it to this day, and I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, it's over 20 years now, which is,
Mhm.
getting to be a pretty cool data set.
I love long-term monitoring. I think long-term research is sort of something that I want to stay involved in very much because there's just a lot of different questions that are really interesting and that are really relevant that you can't really answer unless you have long-term data.
Yeah.
So
So what sort of questions are you investigating now in your current research?
yeah, so my current research is more focused on climate change adaptation, and most specifically sort of I'm working with about a dozen populations of brook trout, these small salmonid fish that live in these streams in Newfoundland. And they all occur in the same area. They all experience roughly the same climate conditions, so the same air temperature, the same rainfall. But these populations are sort of responding very differently to those conditions in the last 10 years. And the questions that I want to figure out are more sort of, how do these populations differ in their biology, and sort of which of those differences really matter for how they're responding to environmental change now and how they're going to respond in the future. And one of the reasons why I'm really interested in this system is because a lot of it sort of has a lot of the data is actually sort of relevant for the evolution of these animals in addition to just their population dynamics. So I think it's a really valuable perspective to add to the fisheries training that I've had already, and I'm excited to dig more into it.
It sounds like a great way to, just as you're saying, build on what you've already done and expand your skill sets to a whole new horizon.
Mm-hmm.
So sort of at the micro level, what does a day look like for you as you're pursuing your PhD?
So recently, I've been doing a lot of work, reading papers and building spreadsheets. One of my chapters is, I actually will not be working in Newfoundland. It'll be what's called a meta-analysis, where essentially you just read a bunch of papers and extract data from those published studies and then analyze them all together using some common metric. So I'll be doing that. That's one of my main PhD chapters, and I have this very bright undergraduate student who's helping me with it as well. And that's sort of what we're working on a lot together this semester and probably next semester as well.
That's great that you're getting to mentor someone.
Yeah, no, it's very nice.
It sounds like you've had a cool path of discovery in terms of figuring out what your research interests are and what your career interests are. What advice would you give to a kid who's interested in a career in a science, technology, engineering, or math field?
Keep playing outside. Try to actually spend time outside, sort of seeing and handling some of the critters and systems that you care about. So I went fishing all the time. I'd love to go and catch frogs and salamanders. Keep doing that stuff. And then, and when you can, read. There's a lot of books that I read when I was a kid that I think really did sort of just help keep me on that track of being interested in animals and wildlife.
And what about for an older student a bit further down the line? Someone arriving at the Chesapeake Biological Laboratory today, do you have any advice that you give them?
If you're just starting out at CBL and you're in a master's program, you're in a great master's program, congratulations. But I really think the most important thing is to try to figure out as early as possible what you want out of the degree, what you can see yourself doing in terms of a long-term career, the kind of lifestyle you want to have. For example, I'm still interested in the long term in an academic career, maybe being a professor, and that involves a lot of sacrifices. For a lot of people, it makes it much more difficult to sort of live in a city that you'd really want to live in, for example, because there's a better job somewhere else. And I think the sooner you can sort of map out what you want out of life in general and out of your career more specifically, and if you're not sure, then take some time, work, maybe try to get a job where you can maybe sort of diversify your skill sets a little bit. But take your time.
So in 10 years, in terms of your career path, it sounds like you're interested in potentially becoming a professor.
I do think that I would really enjoy the role as a professor, having my own lab, teaching classes, trying to positively influence the next generation of young people coming into the field. I've done some sort of mentoring, and I've given a lot of presentations, and I get a lot of energy out of that. And even, of course, as a professor, you can work at a smaller institution and focus on teaching, for example, or you could be at a larger research-based school. Yeah. So there's a lot of options. I still don't know all the answers, but that's where I see myself in 10 years.
Well, I think as we continue in our careers, we're always evolving and always, trying to figure out where we want to end up. But it's nice to have that sort of trajectory I think you'd be great at being a professor. And it sounds like you're getting some good experience in mentoring students with your undergrad that you're working with. And, it sounds like it's going very well for you, Brian. And it's certainly nice to talk to you today. I appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, no problem, Sarah. This has been really nice. If anyone has any questions, you can send them my way.
That's great. All right, Brian, thank you so much. I hope you have a nice day.
All right, thanks. You too, Sarah.
All right, bye.
Bye.